Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Leicester. My name is Henrietta O'Connor and I'm the PVC and Head of the College of Social Science, Arts and Humanities. I'm delighted to have been asked to introduce Professor Ruth Young's inaugural lecture this afternoon and to welcome you all. A benefit of being virtual is that people are able to attend wherever they are, and it's a pleasure to see so many of you have logged in. Although they're not able to watch the lecture live, I'd like to welcome Ruth's family in New Zealand and her husband Paul, who's in Beirut, but who'll watch the recording of this lecture later on. Today's event is an important part of the university's centenary celebrations, and it's one of the first inaugural lectures in the series from our college. Yesterday, October the 4th, was the 100th birthday of the University of Leicester. 100 years ago marked the start of our story and our legacy as a university to honour those who made sacrifices during the Great War. Thank you for joining us to mark this historic milestone and to celebrate a new chapter in Professor Young's career. Having said that, Ruth was actually promoted to chair over 2 years ago, but the pandemic has of course delayed many events and this inaugural is no exception. It's wonderful to finally be able to formally celebrate Ruth's career in this way. She joined the university in 2000, securing a permanent contract in 2004. Ruth had completed her PhD on archaeological work in the former northwest frontier province of Pakistan in the Department of Archaeological Sciences at the University of Bradford, where she also studied for her MPhil and her undergraduate degree. Ruth joined Bradford as a mature student, and this experience underpins much of her teaching and student-focused work here at Leicester. She's always been a huge supporter of our distance learning students and in making educational opportunities accessible to all. Ruth's based here in Leicester now, but I've often come across her on her way to the train station as she sets off on her travels. Her research is very international. She works in South Asia, in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and parts of the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Oman and Lebanon. And these areas are linked by her interest in place, in memory and belonging. She's currently focusing on the heritage and historical and contemporary archaeology in these regions, as well as exploring post-conflict archaeology and heritage. I'm going to hand over to Ruth now to deliver her lecture, which is titled In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, Place, Memory and Belonging. Ruth, over to you.
Hello. As Henrietta has just said, I'm Ruth Young. I'm based here in the School of Archaeology and Ancient History here at Leicester. And thank you, Henrietta, for such a kind introduction. And thanks indeed to the team who've worked on this series of inaugural lectures, particularly Annette Brooks, Emma Abubakar and Thomas Everly. And now over to my presentation slides. In this centenary inaugural lecture, I would like to talk about ideas of place, memory and belonging, and draw on some of my work in archaeology and heritage to look at the ways in which people use places, buildings, objects and memory to create senses of belonging, to think about how places shape people and indeed how people shape places, and that places are not just neutral backdrops for our lives but have great impact on them. And a good place to start is by introducing the book that inspired part of the title of this talk, the collection of linked stories by the American Pakistani writer Daniel Muinuddin, In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, published in 2010. These stories explore the relationships between members of a large Punjabi Pakistani household, and in doing so covers things like class relations, society and changing social orders, corruption, gender, wealth and poverty. The stories are exceptional in my view for evoking life in Pakistan, and they are also deeply rooted in place, and that is place of rural Pakistan. The large farm and village are the reason for the connections and actions in the story, and are as important as the actual people in this book. Even when the story takes place elsewhere, in Lahore for example, the farm and village have shaped and are shaping the way the characters think, react and interact with others. Muinuddin writes about people who are often corrupt, unkind and exploitative. He doesn't shy away from flaws and he uses the ordinary and the everyday to explore bigger issues. His writing unfolds the contradictions and challenges that he sees in daily life in Pakistan, the hardships and sometimes brutalities, but also the rhythms of being in a place and being connected to other people in that place, and of course the multiple kind actions and the beauty of people in places. He writes about a place that, although fictional, is very real, very recognisable, and he uses descriptions of clothes, things and buildings to show character and place. The writers use fragments to evoke a whole picture. For example, Muinadin writes in one of his stories, "From the smuggler's market in Rawalpindi, he had bought her this flowery tea set kept unused on a shelf." And this phrase tells us a lot, not just about the relationship between two characters, but about objects that are valued and how this value is shown, and also about how they are obtained, the social acceptance of dubious commerce. And archaeologists, of course, do something rather similar. We take small parts, small samples of the leftovers of other people's lives, and we use them to create narratives about whole settlements and societies. I like Muinadin's writing, not only because it takes me to a Pakistan I recognise, but also because he uses many of the same tools for the same purposes as archaeologists, particularly those interested in the everyday and the ordinary to tell stories about people and how they lived. Place and the things we find in places such as buildings, shared and private spaces and artefacts are important for allowing archaeologists to understand more about people in the past. So I would say place has social and political significance as well as personal meaning. I first went to Pakistan in 1997 to carry out fieldwork for my PhD, which looked at different rural and urban lifeways in the early historic period, roughly 900 BCE to 200 CE, through food production and consumption. And I have to thank my PhD supervisor, Professor Robin Cunningham, now based at Durham University, but then newly arrived at the University of Bradford, for introducing me to Pakistan, particularly what was then the Northwest Frontier Province, and since 2010 renamed Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Province, or KP for short. And this map shows the areas where I carried out work for my PhD, in Chisada, Dir and Swat, and then in Dir and Chitral for subsequent projects. So my PhD allowed me to work at the big urban site of Chisada, just outside the city of Peshawar, and also to travel north into the valleys of Swat and Dir to explore rural sites. During my PhD fieldwork, I started to interview people, both settled farming families and transhumant families, to inform the archaeological material I was working with. The multiple approaches to seasonal movement between valleys and plains and within valleys was clearly very important. And this was when I started to think about place, where mobile groups thought of as home, and what was important about the different elements of their seasonal travels. I also found that I really enjoyed talking to people about how they lived, how they used place, objects and buildings within their lives. I also got the chance to fire this Kalashnikov machine gun, which is something that I'm pretty sure was not covered by Bradford's health and safety policies even back in the 90s, though I'm not entirely sure that would have stopped me. And of course, if anyone from Leicester's Health and Safety Division happens to be listening to this, I reassure them that I would never do anything like this now, absolutely not. Now, during the Chisada project and my PhD, I worked alongside colleagues from the Department of the Archaeology at Peshawar University. Many of the people that I met then remain colleagues and friends, and our current collaborators in Pakistan are among those who are students alongside me in the field. After my PhD finished, I came to Leicester, and I wanted to carry on working in Pakistan to continue with some of the ideas and issues that I had only scratched on in my dissertation. So with Professor Dr. Ihsan Ali of Peshawar University, I obtained funding and permissions to carry out survey work in the district of Dir in Western Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Dir is a relatively understudied area of KP, and we were able to record sites from multiple different periods, from the prehistoric through Buddhist to structures from the British period. We recorded a number of grave sites where the graves were made from stone slabs in a style called Gandharan graves, but they were named so by the Italian team who'd worked for many years in Swat. Now, building on this work with Professor Ihsan and drawing in younger colleagues such as Dr. Abdul Samad, who is now the Director of Archaeology and Museums in KP, and Dr. Mohammed Zahir, who is now a member of staff at Azhar University in Mansehra, we started a further project working further north in Chitral district. Chitral is one of the most remote areas in Pakistan, located as it is up against the border with Afghanistan and cut off from the rest of KP in winter for months at a time, when the snow makes the roads impassable and planes from Peshawar or Islamabad cannot make the flight up through the mountains. And the PIA plane shown here, resting in the fields, was actually turned into a restaurant and was still open, as far as I'm aware, back in 2019. The Chitral Valley is a beautiful place. It was formerly a princely state and home to over 40 peaks, more than 6,000 metres high, including Tirachmir at just over 7,700 metres high. We carried out more archaeological surveys here in some very challenging landscapes and identified sites from multiple periods again and again, from prehistoric through to the British. Here are some pictures of our Chitral teams at work locating and recording graves and also during excavation. Now, we carried out some excavations to understand a very distinctive burial tradition, using stone slabs to create a box or kist grave, a style widespread across Swat, Deir and Chitral, and described first by the Italian archaeological mission to northern Pakistan in the 1960s and 70s as the Gandharan grave culture. We sent some of our bone samples for radiocarbon dating analysis, and the results showed that we were, in fact, looking at burials from different periods, hundreds, if not thousands of years apart. So we asked, could this be understood in the traditional approach of an archaeological culture? Well, we argued that this was something rather different, something more about memory and place, and these distinctive grave types show continuity of practice within place. Living in three remote valleys, Bumbaret, Rambur and Biria, branching off the main Chitral Valley, the Kalash people comprise the largest non-Muslim minority in the Hindu Kush and stand out from the surrounding Muslim co-people in multiple ways. The Kalash follow an animist religion with a pantheon of gods. They celebrate festivals such as Chilam Joshi, the spring festival, and Uchal, the summer festival, and are permitted to make wine for their own consumption. But perhaps most noticeably and photogenically, Kalash women have striking traditional dress and do not cover their hair as most local Muslim women do. Kalash social norms include quite different gender roles and rights to the Muslim code. Learning about the deep Kalash sense of place and sense of belonging was a great privilege, and part of our project work supported Kalash claims that they had previously settled a far greater part of Chitral than their three current valleys. It was also interesting to explore the differences between the Kalash and the Muslim Co around what was valued in Kalash heritages. We talked about Kalash understandings of the concepts of archaeology and heritage and what these things could and should do for their communities. And Dr. Samad, one of the project members and then a project co-director, has taken this work forward within his current role as Director of Archaeology and Museums KP, and is a champion of Kalash heritage and rights. Now, our work in Chitral took a variety of forms and project names and continued right up until 2017. Absolutely, working on different projects and in different parts of KP has been endlessly interesting, and the archaeology and heritage there from multiple periods is very impressive in terms of richness and range. And this is where my interest in place started, learning about where people feel they belong and how this is expressed in buildings and objects. And I particularly enjoyed being able to talk to people directly about this, as the majority of archaeological work is based on inference and piecing together material culture remains within a theoretical framework in order to try and learn about human decisions and impulses in the past. I'm very happy to say that we have a new project in Pakistan working with Hazara University and the Directorate of Archaeologies and Museums KP, which has just started this year, and we'll be looking at the archaeology and heritage of the British period in KP. Now that COVID travel restrictions have eased, I'm very keen to get back out there and start work on this. My interest in place developed through this work in Pakistan crystallised and developed further in my work in Iran and Oman, which I'll talk about next, starting with Iran. Now, connections are always important in fieldwork in South Asia and the Middle East, and Iran is no exception. While a PhD student at Bradford, I shared an office for many years with Hassan Faisali, a young lecturer from Tehran University, also doing his PhD under the supervision of Robin Cunningham. In 2003, when Dr. Faisley was back working in Tehran, he set up a project with Robin and asked me if I would like to join them. Now, for me, this was a great opportunity to learn firsthand about Iranian archaeology. And between 2003 and 2006, I worked with them on a survey project in the Tehran Plain. This survey was multi-period, identifying and recording sites from the Neolithic through to the recent past, with a focus on sites from the Chalcolithic period, and I learned a lot from both Hassan and Robin working here. Being in Iran and working in very different types of landscapes and with different archaeologies to Pakistan was an amazing opportunity for me, one that I greatly enjoyed. But one site that we came across in the survey started to intrigue me. While walking over the landscape, we kept coming across abandoned, walled mudbrick villages. Now, they were recorded as part of the project, but as they were described as recent, they were not the research focus and so were largely overlooked. And these sites were described as landlord villages. I found them fascinating and wanted to know more about them, so read up about them between seasons. And landlord villages are, among other things, linked to the last Shah of Iran, so potentially linked to such memories as exploitation, dire poverty, to the major class divisions in Iranian society over centuries. And in collaboration with Hassan Faisley, we started the Landlord Villages of the Tehran's Plain project. This was the first project in Iran to draw together archaeological planning and excavation with interviews and site visits with former residents of the village. Landlord villages were a major element of rural Iran for many centuries, representing not only the dominant form of land tenure, but also the dominant form of socio-economic organisation, which ensured that wealth and power was concentrated in the hands of a very small number of elites. The vast majority of the population, however, lived in what many historical accounts describe as great poverty, with all the accompanying social evils. Wealthy absentee landlords owned whole villages, which were usually enclosed by high mudbrick walls, as well as the surrounding agriculture and grazing lands. These landlords decided who would live within their villages and which plots of land they could cultivate. The system is often described as feudal, but while in medieval Britain agricultural workers had some measure of security through inherited rights, nothing like that existed in the landlord system in Persia. The White Revolution of the 1960s was ostensibly Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's attempt to redistribute ownership of agricultural land from large landlords to the tenants. The long and short-term outcomes of this revolution have been extensively debated, but it did result in partially breaking the centuries-old stranglehold of the landed elite, and many of the walled mud brick villages were abandoned at the time of the White Revolution or shortly afterwards. Given the social and economic constraints placed on the tenants living within these villages, we wanted to look at the ways in which people lived in circumstances of such uneven power relations. We argued that the buildings and their spatial arrangements, in other words, the place that is these villages, acted ideologically to legitimate the power of the landlord and obscure inequalities in terms of hierarchy. The physical structures are a way of both controlling and ordering the farmers and their families, and of presenting an established order within the villages. We also wanted to document a selection of these villages before they were entirely lost through weathering and industrial and agricultural encroachment, and record some of these first-hand memories of life in the villages before they too were lost. So over 3 fieldwork seasons, 2007, 2008 and 2009, we recorded village plans and standing remains of 3 abandoned villages in the Tehran Plains, and these villages were Kazimabad, Hossein-abad Sangar and Gacha. We also carried out ethnographic interviews with people who had lived in or been closely associated with the villages, and we excavated a series of trenches at Kazimabad. Landlord villages were divided into the landlords and the tenant farmers areas, and unsurprisingly the landlord's area was large, shown here as the yellow block, which takes up more than half the village. And at Kazimabad, the landlord had extended his garden by knocking down tenants' houses that had been located in the sort of the L part of the yellow piece that you see. And as we can see here at Kazimabad, there was a series of dedicated rooms and buildings within the landlord section of the village. These included a sizable animal stabling block, a hammam, a wing of reception rooms, and a wing of women's rooms. These pictures show some of these rooms and areas, and you can see that they were well built and very well decorated. The buildings and garden were visible demonstrations of greater wealth and investment than the tenants' houses. In contrast, the tenants' houses were much smaller and were very uniform in size and layout, being 2 small rooms separated by a smaller storeroom. And the landlord's area of the village was completely separated from the tenants' area by high internal walls that would have stood up to around 2 to 3 meters high when the village was occupied, thus clearly demonstrating the physical gulf between the landlord and the tenants. One of the most distinctive features of landlord villages was the very high mudbrick walls which surrounded and enclosed them, distinguishing them from kalisa or crown land and villages where farmers owned or rented the land they worked. These walls were built to a height of some 4 meters with 4 mudbrick towers at each corner and represented a significant investment in terms of both materials, purchasing mud bricks from nearby brickmakers, and the labour to build and repair them, and were likely to have served a number of purposes, both practical and symbolic and ideological. They would have provided protection from bandits who terrorised rural settlements, thieves from preying on herds, wild animals from threatening people, animals and stored grain, and from some of the extremes of weather. And they would also have made an immediate statement about the landlord's wealth, status, and power to delimit land and people. The towers themselves were described by various tenants as lookout points and storage areas. Apart from the issues of visibility in a wider plain landscape, protection and storage, these walls and towers would also have played a vital role in the construction and maintenance of power. They enclosed the whole village and all of those in them, providing the boundaries of physical landscape within which control was centred. At the same time, they performed the function of being a tangible expression of control for farmers, and they would also have played an important role in constructing and iterating a sense of belonging to the landlord village, and thus were a powerful component of both group and individual identity. The village walls and towers would have been visible from any part of the village, meaning that there was no escape from this potent symbol of the landlord and all they represented. One connection with the past beyond living memory takes the form of 2 structures that were rather puzzling when viewed on the ground. When we first began work at the village, our informants mainly said that they did not know what the structures had been part of or used for. A few offered explanations for these structures, such as communal oven, communal lavatory, and when we asked about the different explanations, we were always told, of course, that the others we had spoken to were wrong. There was a part of the wall that was attached to one of these structures but did not really appear to serve any clear purpose on the ground. However, when we planned the village and viewed the structures from above, they stand out as the remains of the bastions and walls from an earlier and smaller village. They have the same morphology as the current bastions and walls and the same positioning of towers at the corners. We excavated across the base of the old wall in order to obtain possible samples for scientific dating, but were not able to recover anything suitable. There were no foundations evident, and the mudbrick walls appear to be built directly onto the flattened land surface without any kind of foundation trench. These remains of an earlier smaller village still standing within the current village are important in terms of understanding place and memory, because they indicate not only a long-lived village morphology, but that the landlord chose to build the new village around older remains. So the memories of life in the landlord villages that were shared with us through interviews and site visits show that these villages were not all bad as places. Despite the descriptions and discussions by historians and ethnographers of landlord villages as places of poverty, deprivation, and often extreme justice, no doubt all of which was true for most, if not all of these villages, They were places where people lived and where they felt a sense of belonging and attachment. There was also a strong emphasis on community among the farmers living in the village and equality. We were all the same. We shared everything, were common refrains. Visiting the village of Gacha with interviewees was very revealing to us in terms of understanding the place of Landlord Villages' memory. While the villages of Kazimabad and Hossainabad Sangar were open to any passers-by and a part of the wider landscape, Gacha was subsumed into the security zone of the new Imam Khomeini airport back in the 1990s. No civilians are allowed into the security zone of the airport unaccompanied, and when our team worked at Gacha, we had to first obtain high-level government clearance and then go through daily security clearance, and we were accompanied by airport security staff at all times. Having arranged clearance with the airport authorities in advance, we were able to take 8 former village inhabitants back to Gacha, all of us going through the regular security screening before being allowed to drive to the village, and we were accompanied by 2 officials for the whole day. When we reached the village, our interviewees became very emotional. They said that they had not been able to return to the village in all the time that had passed since being evicted, and they were very happy to be able to visit. One of the women cried, and all of the village visitors were eager to walk around. They were horrified by the physical damage and decay, and delighted by the familiarity of the place, and with memories always around them. They had brought food with them, and we had a picnic, all carrying out interviews and hearing stories of the village. This was a day out for them, a treat to be enjoyed, although also very emotional and even upsetting at times. They were humouring a foreign visitor, but they were also very pleased to be able to go back to Gacha. As individuals, even former residents, they would not have been able to visit the village themselves. They remembered key places and the importance they had had in their lives, despite not having seen them for around 15 years. The village and the surrounding fields were all important places in their memories and in the stories they told us about their lives here. Maybe their memories were selected or selective. They spoke of good things such as neighbourliness, community values, sharing and happiness in relation to these places. They also told us about hardships, about poverty and about things like drug use, but they emphasised their memories of a good everyday life in the village. In particular, sharing and neighbourliness were emphasised, with one older male interviewee telling us that if we wanted to eat lunch or dinner, we didn't have to go to our own house. We would go to any house because we were all so close, like family. And this suggests an openness in terms of the social network, which came with living within the confines of the walled village. To them, this was not a landlord village, it was home. So in this study, we learned a great deal about these villages as places where physical structures were key to creating and maintaining power, and also about how people lived their lives within such dramatic constraints. It became very clear that while life in these villages had been very poor indeed, they had massive value as places, as holders of memory, and for many of those we spoke to, a part of their sense of belonging was linked to the villages. We were able to use material culture to understand more about the ways in which remote and poor rural places were still part of the wider world in the late 19th and early 20th century in Iran. The Iran project came to a natural conclusion in 2010 to 2011, and I was at a conference in the US in 2012 when I met up with Dr. Chris Thornton, then Director of Excavations for the Penn Museum at the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bat al-Khattum and Al Ain in the Sultanate of Oman. Now, Bat is a Bronze Age site, and Chris is a prehistorian with a strong interest in metallurgy. He had also done some work in Iran and come and visited Kazimabad when Hassan and I were working there. And while Bat is best known for its stunning prehistoric mortuary landscape, it is also a modern town, and like many Omani villages and towns, it has a mud brick core abandoned in the 1970s. Chris was very keen to see this mud brick component recorded and studied before it was lost through weathering and neglect, and invited me out to visit Bat and the mud brick village. I was captivated by Bat, by the mud brick oasis, and I worked there for the next 4 years, using the same combination of planning, excavation, building analysis and interviews with former inhabitants that we had used in Iran in order to develop understandings of the mudbrick structures themselves. And of course, we wanted to learn more about the significance of the mudbrick to former inhabitants and understanding the importance of these buildings and remains of the earlier village's place and memory, and about the intersection of place and memory. I was particularly interested in the period up to the 1970s. That was a pivotal decade in recent Oman history, and how this contrasts with the period since the 1970s. And just like the Iran Landlords project, this was very much about exploring the everyday and about ordinary people. Now, this shows where in Oman the field project was located, because of course cultural geography and geopolitics play a role, particularly in the connections and networks of place. Now, Bat is located in the interior of Oman on the western side of the Al-Hajj Mountains that separate the interior from the coast. And coastal and interior Oman had quite different ways of life prior to the 1970s in terms of ideology, politics and subsistence. So the new Sultan Qaboos bin Taimur Al Said faced many political, economic and social issues in the fractured country that he inherited in the middle of 1970. He was able to effect rapid and profound change in the country in terms of these economic, political and social structures, with a major shift from individuals relying on the sheikh and the tribe for day-to-day and major decision-making to a reliance on state and central management of all aspects of life. And one of Sultan Qaboos's key changes was the instigation of a plan for all families to move out of their mud brick houses into newly built concrete houses. This was required as part of Qaboos's desire to modernise and westernised Oman, as mud brick was neither modern nor western, while concrete block was evidently both in his view. And this focus on housing put place very much at the centre of Qaboos's plans and very much at the centre of the new Oman, whether it was intentional or otherwise. And although Qaboos did not force people to build concrete houses and move, there was very strong, irresistible persuasion at work in the form of both ideological and financial incentives. In order for people to be good citizens loyal to Qaboos and supportive of the new order, and perhaps more importantly to be seen to be this, one very visible symbol of this new order and the new allegiances of the population were houses. And of course, by selecting houses as something that had to be changed, Qaboos was striking at something quite fundamental. Homes are perhaps one of the most intimate places in most people's lives, tied up with memory, identity, belonging, and certainly in Omani villages, core to family structures and village social structures. And I was able to use the oasis or village at Bat as an example of this far-reaching, dramatic and relatively sudden move from mud brick to concrete. So at the centre of Bat, on the highest piece of land, is the mudbrick castle or Hasan al-Wadi, and around it is the remains of the mudbrick village. The castle has not been demolished, although parts of it are currently being severely eroded, and it still sits at the core of the heart of the old village. Part of it is currently used to store crops, and it can be entered and climbed by anyone. In former days, the castle offered protection and advance warning of trouble, and was occupied by the Sheikh's standing army of soldiers or guards, and the need for a permanent guard is part of this pre-1970s security issue in Oman, particularly in the interior. The home of the Sheikh was an imposing mud brick mansion right next to the castle. The mansion is still standing with a new concrete house beside it. The rest of the village or oasis was made up of mud brick mosques, some shops, many houses and mud brick field walls. Houses were not uniform, though they did tend to have a similar suite of rooms for specific functions: a living room, a storeroom, possibly an upstairs bedroom, a kitchen, a room for the animals to stay, be kept in overnight, which was usually accessed only through the kitchen. And some houses were built as linked rows, like a terraced row, particularly those clustering close by the castle, and some as detached houses, some as relatively remote farmhouses. Now, having learned a lot from the Landlord Villages project in Iran, I was keen to interview people here in Bat, people who had lived in the mud brick houses and had been part of the pre-concrete world here. Again, I wanted to explore the connection between place and memory, where memories are stored in place and can be handed down over time. Being aware of the way people tell stories about place to themselves and to others as ways of finding meaning and their place in the world, well, this is something that was very evident in our interviews here in Bat, even more so, I would say, than in Iran. Our interviewees would often tell stories around events that had happened in the villages, even within particular spaces and buildings. And these stories not only helped them to share aspects of life in the villages with us, but also allowed them to find their own place within both the physical and social structures of the village. There's Rashid, a notable figure in the modern village and owner of the Mudbrick house and shop, where we also carried out some of our excavations. And in interviews, Mudbrick often became a shorthand way of referring to particular aspects of the past that are now believed to be lost. These things included neighbourliness, a sense of community and caring, and a general looking out for one another. Living in Mudbrick was very closely linked to a now lost sense of community. Further, interviewees almost always went on to mourn the loss of these social interactions as a result of living in the separateness of the concrete houses. This loss may be as much a result of family fragmentation through political and economic changes that have led to greater urbanisation and separation into nuclear rather than extended families, but interviewees were able to use the buildings, the mud brick here, to represent the major social changes that had occurred in the last 40 to 50 years. Some former occupants that we interviewed also had a sharp sense of problems with mud brick houses, which tended to be about convenience and comfort rather than the wider social and economic structures. For example, here Mohammed told us they were very crowded, that there were too many people in small space with babies crying, animals and breeding. And he also told us that old was small and new was big. So there was very definitely a sense about space here, that new was bigger and better, and the ability to live separately, and that sons, when they married, could live separately from their parents. But interestingly, a sense of loss for the community and the sociability of living in mud brick, and a sense of nostalgia around the lost ways of life did not preclude the appreciation of indoor kitchens, plumbing and electricity. And also the importance of indoor bathrooms and toilets for women was also stressed in terms of privacy and safety in concrete houses compared to the mud brick. But the mud brick is special. It is perceived very much as a place of belonging through family ties, and is the place where there was a true sense of community. The mud brick represents specific things to those who used to live in them, but people are also aware that life has changed, in some ways for the better, and that the material world, the material representation of these changes are both good and bad too. Yet the important issue here is that these people strongly and uniformly associated the mud brick structures and mud brick village with a community that cared about its members and provided strong support. The ruined mud brick structures in evidence today are the tangible link to this past emotion and understanding, and provide this sense of belonging. At least 3 of our interviewees said that the mud brick village was so important to them that it appeared in their dreams. And the mud brick permits older people to remember and reminisce, and it allows nostalgia. The structures, the place, are very powerful, tangible repositories of both memory and belonging. And mud brick is a very clear representation of the past. Many thought it important that this be saved for the next generation so that they did not lose a knowledge of where they came from. Also carried out excavations in Bat, and what we found from the excavations and analysis of the features and artefacts recovered also tells us about place and memory. We excavated within a range of houses and a shop, and from the layers relating to the historical period, i.e. in situ occupation layers up to the 1970s abandonment, we found a range of artefacts such as these date honey making pots from the kitchen. We also found features such as hearths, found posts for coffee grinding, and posts holes for posts for tethering animals, in line with the function of the rooms as discussed during interviews and site visits. All of this confirmed the relative simplicity of the mud brick life in Bat. Small houses with a set of agreed functions for rooms and objects to define these functions, and a reliance on organic materials, particularly date palms, for a wide range of building materials and objects. Now, once below the historical layers, i.e. the layers of the mud brick buildings, we either came down onto natural earth very quickly or directly onto prehistoric layers and features very quickly, depending on the location of the houses. In the houses close to the castle, that is the oldest part of the material, of the village rather, we came down onto prehistoric material. Under the earliest historic floor in the storeroom of Rashid's house, we came down in one end of the trench onto a layer with Iron Age pottery, and then in the other end of the trench, directly onto the top of a Bronze Age stone wall. Directly below the lowest historical layer in the living room of Rashid's house, we came down onto a single burial. There were no artefacts associated with the skeleton, and we were unable to get a radiocarbon date estimate because the bones were too badly degraded. This is a common situation with human burials in this region. Although the skeleton was not exactly facing Mecca, it was partially turned on one side to face east. Our archaeological representative decided it was not an Islamic burial, so he could lift it. But without direct dates on the bones or data from artefacts, it could be any date from around about 150 years old, which is the approximate time Rashid could give us for his great-grandparents building their house in the spot, to Bronze Age, being the earliest known activity here to date. Now, the close, if not closed, communities of pre-1970 interior Oman have been replaced by strong central governance with stable economy, wealth and very good security. Instead of looking to neighbours and sheikh for support and continuity, these people now look to the government, to the Sultan for these things. The move from mud brick houses to concrete houses is a symbol of this fundamental political and social change. And the remaining mud brick houses and other structures provide a powerful place that represents a particular past and are holders and hooks for memory and a way of life that has now changed forever. Key issues which have run through my work to date are memory, place and belonging, and what these mean to people of different cultures in different locations at different times. There are some commonalities, such as the stress placed on being equal and sharing by the people we interviewed in both Bat and Oman and the villages in the Tehran Plain in Iran. There are, of course, differences, for example, around what is remembered of life in the villages and the role that material culture plays in memory. In Bat, the mud brick itself was incredibly important, with the mud brick being used by many as a proxy for family and friends. In Kazmabad and the other landlord villages, there was little explicit connection to the mud brick itself, with former occupants drawing on rooms and spaces to reconstruct their lives there. That the past, whether within or beyond living memory, is important in creating and maintaining place is, I think, shown through material culture in many ways. It might be the continuation of very long-lived grave styles of northern Pakistan, through replicating older village morphology in landlord villages, as well as keeping remains of older villages intact. It is also shown through the location of houses and castle directly over the prehistoric structures in Bat. Keeping parts of the past close to us helps root us in place, links us to family, to ancestors, and it helps us feel part of something enduring. Belonging is about having an attachment to things, to people and to place. It is finding or having a place where we feel at home, with all the meanings that are attached to the idea of home, and it is something fundamentally human. Places and objects can offer very powerful ways of connecting with people, both past and present, as I hope I've shown in this lecture today. And in both Oman and Iran, and indeed many other parts of Middle East and South Asia, the heritage value of the rural and the quotidian is largely under-recognised, and this encompasses things like mudbrick villages. Thinking through whether to consider such sites as heritage, and if so, how to deal with them, requires considerable work, not least of which is the engagement of local communities. Archaeology and heritage help us construct narratives about the past, and these narratives have great political and economic power, so we need to be very careful about the sources that we use and what we select. As I mentioned earlier, I'm working with colleagues at Hazara University in Mansehra and the Department of Antiquities and Museums KP on a new project in Pakistan around British period archaeology and heritage. And I'm also working with Dr. Jill Juleff at Exeter University and colleagues in Jaffna University and the Postgraduate Institute of Archaeological Research in Colombo to co-create a new project with communities and civic groups in Sri Lanka. These projects will also look at place, memory and belonging, among other aims, and draw on experience and knowledge from all of the earlier work. I turn briefly to In Other Rooms, Other Wonders. Without wanting to undertake an in-depth literary analysis, Muinuddin also uses places to negotiate belonging, to help give a sense of belonging to himself, not least through his writing as a dual national split between two countries and cultures. His work draws on his own experiences of returning to Pakistan, having studied at elite universities in the US and working at a prestigious law firm in New York, and his need to reclaim and revitalise the family farm. It is this farm, this place, that challenges and frustrates him, but ultimately provides him with the sense of place, the sense of belonging that so many of us crave. While Muinuddin uses elegant prose to explore people, place and belonging, I've drawn on objects, buildings and people's own accounts of their memories to think through similar ideas. Now, I hope that this journey through parts of South Asia and the Middle East has shown at least a flavour of the power of place and its role creating and supporting memories, and in how people create belonging, something that is more important than ever in our fragile and unpredictable world. Just before I move on to my final thanks, I would like to pay a brief tribute to one of the great Sri Lankan archaeologists, Dr. Suran Durania Ragala, who died earlier today. Suran was a leading prehistorian who contributed to so much of what we know about early Sri Lanka, and he shaped the practice of archaeology there today. I would like to say thank you to a number of people. I'd like to say thank you to the heads of the School of Archaeology and Ancient History here at Leicester who have helped and supported me, to Marilyn Palmer, Colin Hazelgrove, Lynn Foxall and David Mattingly. I'd also like to say thank you to the late and greatly missed Alan McQuirr and Mark Pluchenik, two former heads of distance learning in the School of Archaeology and Ancient History and my former line managers who supported me and taught me a great deal. And thanks to all of my colleagues in the School of Archaeology and Ancient History, which is a great place to work. It was very nice indeed. In particular, I'd like to thank three friends and colleagues, Deirdre O'Sullivan, David Edwards and Sarah Tarlow, for their unstinting support and sharing of knowledge. Beyond the School of Archaeology and Ancient History, I'd like to thank many other colleagues, including Rowie Sweet in the School of History, Audrey Horning of Queen's Belfast, Roger Matthews at Reading, Tim Insoul and Jill Juleff at Exeter and Robin Cunningham at Durham, Chris Thornton and Charlotte Cable, and of course all my colleagues in Pakistan, Iran, Sri Lanka, Oman, Iraq, Lebanon and elsewhere, including but by no means limited to Asan Ali, Shakir Ullah Khan, Samad Ms. Gul Kalash in Pakistan, Haider al-Mamori in Babylon, Roshan Kamal Muhammad Amin in Suleimania, Hassan Faisli, Hossein Azizi and Manu Salimi in Iran, Professor Krishna Raja, Professor Prematilika, Sanatanand Tamatavaramapalai and Hassani Hapitantri in Sri Lanka. And lastly, a very special thanks to my collaborator and partner, Dr. Paul Newson at the American University of Beirut for work at the site of Hosn Niha in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, which has led directly to our work on post-conflict archaeology and heritage. So this is the end of my presentation. Thanks to all of you for listening, that's very kind, and I would now like to pass back to Henrietta.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It was lovely seeing your slide at the end with all the thanks to the people that have contributed to your career. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful insight to your work and a really skillful presentation of your research interests and your enviable experience of working in so many different countries. I think you brought this to life for all of us in a very accessible and enlightening lecture. The focus on your research participants and their lives and the amazing photos you shared have given a real insight to the powerful human stories that form the basis of your work on place, memory and belonging. I'm sure your photographs of fieldwork experience wouldn't worry health and safety in the slightest, but I will reassure our Director of Health and Safety that you are fully aware of the rules and regulations of international travel. If we were in normal times, I'd now be able to ask you all in the audience to join me in a huge round of applause to thank Ruth for such a fantastic lecture. So Ruth, please take a moment to visualise and imagine a tremendous round of virtual applause from your audience this afternoon. I'd also be able to invite everyone to join us for a reception and the opportunity to continue the conversation. And I'm sorry that I can't extend that invitation today, but I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. The virtual environment does allow us to invite many more people from many different places. So there are pluses and minuses. So all that remains for me today is to thank Ruth again on behalf of everyone here and to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thanks very much, Ruth.